Hello everyone, this is Tim, and this is the first follow-up video to the message that is published in this document. In the second part of the document, it speaks of a man named William Miller, who was the first person to publicly proclaim that Christ was going to return in his generation and why he believed that was so. And it also talks about in there that the prevailing sentiment surrounding the return of Christ by the Christian churches in his time was this notion of a golden age that would begin at the beginning of the 20th century and would last for 1,000 years, and that the whole world would be converted during this time, and Christ would return at the end of that 1,000-year period. Well, the First World War kind of flushed that whole idea down the toilet because it's kind of hard to sell people in a golden age after 9 million of them get killed. So that notion disappeared off the annals of world history. But it was replaced with something else. And that something else is popularly referred to as the rapture today. And it's interesting. While I was back visiting family a couple weeks ago, before making these videos, I visited with a friend who is a Roman Catholic, and he asked me about the rapture and if I believed in it. And my first thought was that it was rather interesting that a Catholic would ask me that question, because I know that the rapture is not a teaching of the Roman Catholic Church. But interesting enough also is the fact that the underpinnings of this belief originated in the Roman Catholic Church. And that can be traced back to the year 1543. This was during the time of Martin Luther. The Roman Catholic Church held an ecumenical conference in the city of Trent. The Council of Trent basically is the name of this series of meetings. And the purpose of these meetings was to address the fact that the Protestant Reformation was in full swing. Copies of the Bible were appearing all over the place, and people were starting to see that the Bible not only does not authenticate the power structure of the Vatican, it actually delegitimizes it. And, for people whose livelihood was being supported by this system, that was a problem. So they had to address it, and that was the purpose of the Council of Trent. How do we counter the Reformation? And one of the things that was proposed during this council was an idea advocated by a man by the name of Francisco Ribera, that the Antichrist is not the Pope, which was a conclusion that all of the reformers agreed on. They may not have agreed on everything else, but they all agreed on this one thing. And that was that the office of the Pope was actually the office of Antichrist. And Francisco Ribera began to come up with a doctrine to suggest that that wasn't true, that the Antichrist was actually some satanically possessed individual that would appear in the final generation to try and counter the work of Christ, however that would look. And that really didn't take off outside of Roman Catholicism very well because, like I said, the rest of mainstream society was reading the Bible and coming to their own conclusions, and that wasn't one of them. So this notion really didn't take off at that time. It wasn't until the 1800s when a man in England by the name of Edward Irving, who was involved in something called the Oxford Movement, which was an attempt to try and reunite the Church of England with the Vatican, that this notion started to become popular and considered among people. And one of the people who grabbed hold of this notion was a man named Cyrus Scofield, who incorporated his study notes surrounding this idea into his translation of the Bible that was brought to the United States and published in America in the early 20th century. So this idea of the rapture and this following 7-year tribulation period is actually a 20th century doctrine whose idea began with the Counter-Reformation. And a young man who was a student at Dallas Theological Seminary in the early 1970s by the name of Hal Lindsey published a book called The Late Great Planet Earth. And that book took this idea of the rapture, the 7-year tribulation, and the Antichrist, and introduced it to mainstream America. And this is how it first became popular here in the United States. And around that time, we had cable TV in our house. And once a month, we would get a booklet that would advertise all the movies and shows that were on the cable channels. And I remember looking at the guide, and, you know, the really popular movies at that time, they got played like every day for a month. But I noticed that there was this movie called The Late Great Planet Earth, and it only had one showing, one time, that month, and then it disappeared. I never saw it listed again in any following guides. So the title kind of caught my attention. I'm like, Mom, I want to watch this. And my mom's like, no way, you're not watching that. And I'm like, why? What's the big deal? And she wouldn't really give me an answer. And all I could think was, Mom, if you knew half the stuff Dad let me watch on cable, you'd have a heart attack. But I didn't want to get my dad busted at that time, so I didn't say that. But suffice it to say, I didn't get to watch this. It wasn't until later, after I moved to Arizona in 1992, that I was walking around a local shopping mall and walked past a bookstore, and lo and behold, on the clearance table is this big, nice hardback book called The Late Great Planet Earth. And I'm like, I recognize that book. And it was actually a compilation that contained another book called Satan is Alive and Well on Planet Earth. And between those two titles, I'm like, I want to check this out. So I bought it and read both books. And, it was actually the second book that really sold me on it, because I don't ever remember being told about the existence of Satan in the church that I was raised in. So, you know, I wanted to know what the scoop was on all this. And I had read the Bible, so I, you know, had that foundation. But to read, you know, something that would comment on these things intrigued me. So, as a result of reading those books, I was just really impressed with the author's writing style. So I adopted this view that this book advocated and accepted this notion of the rapture and a 7-year tribulation. And surprisingly enough, the pastor of the Baptist church that I started going to in Arizona did not subscribe to this, and we would argue about this periodically. And, there wasn't anything that he really told me to convince me that this was an erroneous point of view. It wasn't until later when, after moving back to Pennsylvania in 1995, one of my objectives at that time was to get internet access. When I moved back, before I moved, I sold all my computer equipment. So I had nothing when I moved back. So I met up with a friend who built a 386 for me, but unfortunately that computer wasn't powerful enough for me to access the internet at that time. So I didn't actually get internet until 1998 when I got a job at a telecommunications company, and I had my own workstation that had internet access. So I had accumulated a list of websites that I had wanted to visit once I did get on the internet. And one of those websites had a write-up about this rapture doctrine. And he basically pulled the plug on it by showing the mathematical inconsistencies surrounding how time prophecy is used to create this point of view. And that was the thing that left me wondering, okay, this isn't true, so where do I go from here? What does the future look like between now and the second coming? And that prompted me to reread the book, The Great Controversy, for the second time, which resulted in me becoming involved in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. But in the event that the viewer is not aware of what this rapture 7-year tribulation thing actually is, I'll break it down for you. In the book of Daniel, there is a time prophecy that involves a time period that is described as 70 weeks. And that is applied to represent 490 years. 70 weeks times 7. There's a principle in the Bible that talks about using a day for a year in Bible prophecy. So 70 weeks is 490 days. A day for a year would be 490 years. The people who advocate this 7-year tribulation do so by applying the first 69 weeks of this 70-week prophecy, representing the restoration of Israel after they were taken into captivity by the Babylonian armies, until the time of Christ. And then the crucifixion of Christ indicates the end of that 69th week of time, leaving the 70th week of time to be fulfilled later after an event that they call the rapture. And what the rapture is Christ removing his people from this world for a 7-year time period. And then at the end of that 7-year time period, the second coming of Christ takes place, and the believers are part of that coming, and the events in the wake of that occur. And as I said, the problem with that application of the prophecy is, first of all, there's two problems with that. The first problem is there's two different calendars that are used to apply the prophecy, the first part, and a second calendar is used to make the second part fit. And the reason that is done is because of the event that is used to declare the beginning of the time prophecy. The time doesn't fit. 69 weeks would be 483 years. But that time period that they use isn't actually 483 years, it's only 476 years. So in order to eliminate 13 years out of their time, they insinuate that that particular time is based on the Babylonian calendar, because Daniel was in Babylonian captivity at the time that this prophecy was revealed to him. But then they use the modern calendar for the last week in order to get a 7-year time period, because they need a 7-year time period in order to make all the events of Revelation fit in their interpretation of it. So they're using two different calendars to make the prophecy fit in two different periods, which to me is a mathematical inconsistency. And also, the event that they use to make the first part of the prophecy apply is actually the wrong event. The right event, which is disclosed in the Bible, actually works with the 483-year time period as is, based on the calendar as we know it today. And that time period, that event that starts the beginning of the prophecy, has to do with the Persian Empire allowing Israel to return to their homeland and rebuild their temple and reenact their government. So there's two problems with this rapture tribulation doctrine that is so popular today. But even apart from that, if you're not acquainted with the scope of history as it's given in the Bible, everything I just said probably went over your head. But even with that, the more insidious and diabolical problem with this doctrine is the notion that it gives unbelievers the idea that if you don't believe the message the first time and you miss the rapture, you have a second chance to believe the message before Christ returns and judgment is executed. And Jesus never said anything to indicate that that's how it would be. According to the Bible, when Jesus was asked what would be the sign of your coming and of the end of the world, referring to the 24th chapter of Matthew. This is also documented in the 21st chapter of Luke and in the 13th chapter of Mark. These are all addressing the same question. Jesus is asked by his disciples, what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the world? And out of everything Jesus says in answer to that question, which is quite a bit, one of the things he says is, as it was in the days of Noah, so will it be in the days of the Son of Man. In the days of Noah, they ate, they drank, they built, they married. Everybody was just living their life until the flood came and took them all away. So, in the days of Noah, God gave that generation a message. And they had one chance to believe the message and to act on that message. And if they didn't, that was it. They were gone. The storm came and wiped them all out. And Jesus is saying this is how it will be in the final generation when he returns. God will send forth a message to this generation. This generation will have one opportunity to accept that message, and if they do not accept the message, they will deal with the storm. And, the point in making these videos is to make the point, the message is here. It's published. So now this generation will deal with the message. And as stated in the document, this message actually began in 1831, and it's been going since then. And the people who are advocating this whole rapture 7-year tribulation thing are in for a very disappointing and overwhelming surprise, because as people do believe the message, that makes them eligible to receive the outpouring of his Spirit, which is talked about in the document, the latter rain. We're living in a time of the latter rain right now. It's happening. And the people who receive that are going to have power that people who believe lies are not going to have. And that is going to polarize people, unfortunately. And, those who believe error are going to realize they don't have any power. So they're going to want to acquire it from another source. And that's where the union of church and state comes in. And the enforcement of the mark of the beast and all that is associated with that. So, anyway, that's all I'm going to say about this for now. If anybody has any questions about this, I'd be happy to answer them. But I'm definitely going to make another video addressing the power structure of the Roman Catholic Church, because I said earlier about people reading the Bible and seeing that the Bible does not authenticate the Vatican's claims as being Christ Church. And, there's just a lot that can be said about that. It's a whole other video in itself. So that will be the subject of the next video. But until then, I hope everyone's doing well, and talk to you all then. Bye.